Educational institutions in the U.S. were supposed to represent equality of opportunity, but there are still persisting inequalities at the heart of America's educational system. Hundreds of thousands of American students have been exposed to gun violence during school hours, and there has been a large number of deadly shooting incidents at American schools. Experts have also labeled the issue of student debt. That's a big problem. It's called a national crisis at this point, which is dragging down the economy, fueling the racial wealth gap, and even destroying lives. Then teachers, they're frustrated. Although their job comes with unique challenges, the majority of them earn a solid middle-class wage at best. Hello, and welcome to Decision 2020. I'm Kaveh Taghwaee. It's decision time for Americans, and it's right around the corner. And this is set to be the most historic vote for them, the impact we felt around the world. Yet unfortunately, the topic we've covered in this program, like the U.S. educational system, is not the one being covered by mainstream candidates.
In the United States, the school system is viewed as an educational ladder, a concept used by the Americans to reflect the value of individual success and the equal opportunity for working one's way to the top. However, although the Civil Rights Acts of the mid-1960s eventually ended the legality of the infamous practice of school segregation and educational inequality in the U.S., students still receive dramatically different learning opportunities based on their social status. In many areas, the cost of education is rising much more rapidly than the average family income is. There are striking differences between white and non-white students' access to key educational resources, including skilled teachers, quality curriculum, sufficient funding, and essential classroom materials. Schools receive a large percentage of their money from local property taxes. As a result, the wealthier school districts offer better educational opportunities. Recent reports show that predominantly white school districts receive nearly $23 billion more in funding than other non-white school districts, despite serving roughly the same number of students. This shows that racial gaps and residential patterns are directly linked to educational disparities in the U.S.
I think we're going to go with Joe Biden. Donald Trump is the president, but they say he's not normal, not mainstream, and it shows in his presidency.
I think that we're exactly where we need to be. I think we need to put President Trump back in for 4 more years and keep the economy growing.
Get Trump out of office. That's what that's going to be.
I think they need to come across here with a vote for Biden because I don't think very much is happening under Trump.
I think people are more cognizant of what's going on right now. I think more people have an opinion, more people are actually trying to vote, and so I think it's going to be a more representative outcome than it was last time.
A series of university research in the year 2019 surprisingly showed that New York schools are the most segregated in the U.S. That revealed that they not only isolated students by race, but also by their socioeconomic status. Let's hear more about that.
We have such a disparity between schools that largely serve Black and Latino populations, and then the small number of schools that white parents tend to send their children to. And so I've been covering school segregation for a long time, but then had my own child who was 4 years old, and I was having to suddenly pick a school for her in this very segregated system.
Even if these schools were roughly equivalent academically, as that would still be a violation of the principle of Brown versus Board of Education, that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. But in practice, they are very rarely equal in any way. Black and Latino children are more likely to attend schools with inexperienced teachers, which are then less likely to offer a college prep curriculum. On top of which, because race and class are inextricably linked, those students are 6 times as likely to be in high-poverty schools. And while there are teachers and students working incredibly hard in those places, they are often doing so with fewer resources.
Okay, I mean, talking about this in the year 2020 is quite incredible. All right, Nikole Hannah-Jones, author of New York Times Magazine article, "Choosing a School for My Daughter," is what you heard there along with John Oliver. just courtesy of them, in order to bring the point across. Well, having heard that, let's get our first guest in and hear the guest's opinion about the ongoing racism crisis that's happening at U.S. schools and the potential political solutions for this problem. James Brewer is an assistant professor of social foundations of education at the University of North Georgia with expertise in education policy surrounding issues of public schools, the privatization of schools, and issues of equity and justice. Hello, Jameson. Welcome to Decision 2020. First question, the U.S. has a clear two-pronged approach when it comes to schooling, with white middle classes being at a clear advantage compared to the black lower classes. How do you think that this should be addressed when it comes to each of the mainstream candidates?
I think that it's clear that the United States has a historical equity issue when it comes to racial justice across our society, but especially in our schools. Something that we learned just last year that we've always known intuitively is that schools that dominantly serve white students receive approximately an additional $23 billion in funding per year. Now, of course, the significant portion of that difference is because the way that we fund schools is heavily dependent on property taxes here in the United States.
Wow, interesting point that he makes there. We appreciate that, James Brewer. He talked about equity issue and how white students are receiving, the schools that is, $20 billion more when it comes to their budget in terms of property taxes, perhaps. And of course, that is a clear disadvantage for the schools that have people of color in it. Well, when we take a look at the way that this situation is evolving in the U.S., keeping the schools safe is another challenge that U.S. administrations have been facing amid a steady rise in school shootings all across the country in the past decades.
Research shows that a majority of American teenagers are worried about the possibility of a shooting happening at their schools. Many students and parents are outraged by what they refer to as gross incompetence on part of school and law enforcement officials. They have repeatedly called for gun legislation and further school safety measures, but different U.S. administrations, whether Republican or Democrat, have flip-flopped on their pledges for new gun control laws. Although some state legislators have passed several gun control regulations in recent years, the National Rifle Association continues to press lawmakers to prioritize the interests of gun owners across the U.S. That shows that the fate of hundreds of thousands of innocent children lies in the hands of one of the most powerful lobby groups in the U.S., the foremost defender of the country's controversial Second Amendment of the right of the people to keep and bear arms.
Anxiety over potential school shootings has created a common fear among Americans, and many people persistently use any platform that they have to express their anger towards these senseless tragedies. Let's see what some people have to say about this on social media. Taking a look at the first tweet here. The U.S. has seen a school shooting phenomena since exactly the date we enacted gun-free zones, and yet politicians would rather see children die than get rid of this law. Well, that is true, but it's the politicians who are, I guess, exercising their amendments in terms of the right to own guns. Next one from Softy. Gun violence, one of my all-time fears, and I was lucky enough to grow up without having to survive a school shooting. It impresses me so much that survivors are dealing with that trauma and also doing what they can to mobilize and speak out on gun control and get out the vote. Get out the vote, of course, but who's been speaking about that this year? The candidates, the mainstream ones anyways, are not really covering this. Okay, back to our guest, James Brewer, professor of social foundations of education, UNG, to talk about this violent practice and its consequences for the U.S. education system. James Brewer, welcome back. Gun crime and mass shootings is a major issue in schools in the U.S. Having seen multiple occasions where atrocities have been committed on school grounds, how do you think education can actually play a part in ending gun crime?
I think that it's also clear that the United States has a gun violence problem. I think that we have in this country approximately 2 to 3 guns for every person in our country. So I think that the answer to the question, I think that schools can play a part. I think that clearly teachers and educators and administrators and counselors think that they can, and historically they always have been and can continue to serve students and serve community needs and provide resources for students who are hurting, provide resources to communities and the broader society. But I think that the answer to the question, I think it has to come from a broad societal sort of examination of how this country approaches particularly gun ownership, but also the mass expansion of gun ownership over the past few decades, because I think that teachers and educators can play a part, but I think it'd be very difficult for teachers in schools by themselves to fix what is in effect a societal issue.
Okay, thank you very much. That is James Brewer, Professor of Social Foundations of Education at UNG, with his comments on that. But I mean, he makes a lot of good suggestions, granted, but how can the U.S. president, who's saying that Democrat-run cities are the ones that are suffering from crime, if he's segregating it into those two categories, red and blue states, do you think there's going to be any solutions?
The U.S. economy largely relies on its vast infrastructure network, but these systems were built decades ago and they suffer from comparatively low quality. Experts are warned about safety concerns, and the American Society of Civil Engineering has given the U.S. infrastructure a low grade. Daily inconveniences for longer commutes, structural deficiency for bridges, antiquated drinking water, internet provision, wastewater systems, and air transportation all need upgrades and observations. That is while other developed countries enjoy more reliable and efficient services. Meanwhile, different polls show that the majority of American people and businesses support rebuilding the infrastructure. So why is the U.S. lagging behind its international peers, such as France, Germany, and Japan, in infrastructure? These discrepancies can be traced back to very different funding levels, either through tax, tolls, or private investment.
It seems that the U.S. infrastructure is in a dire state. Let's hear more about this.
We have 16 categories of infrastructure. We put together a pool of experts, about 30 different civil engineers who are analyzing. A lot of it is data that's available through the federal government. So we're looking at aviation, bridges, roads, transit, dams, levees, schools, parks, solid waste, drinking water, wastewater. So all of these different categories are analyzed. Unfortunately, 12 out of the 16 categories are in the D range, which is poor or at risk, which is really reflecting a lot of our infrastructure being at the end of its useful life.
More stimulus is needed. I mean, the two problems the economy faces, the two big headwinds are, number one, obviously the pandemic, and we're not going to see the economy fully recover until the pandemic is totally contained. But the other is we've got to have adequate money in people's pockets. We've got to have a stimulus that enables people to spend. And obviously, if people don't have enough money to spend, they're not going to be able to get the economy moving. The multiplier effect that comes from the bottom 80% of this economy's spending is really what this economy fundamentally depends on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's very alarming when you take a look at how, in that report by the engineers for the U.S. in terms of infrastructure as a whole, that you have actually drinking water in the D range. 4 out of the 6 categories is in D range. Well, let's bring in our guests to see what the main economic challenges are that the U.S. Is facing in terms of its infrastructure. We're going to bring in William K. Black, Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. William, it's great to have you with us. The U.S. infrastructure is crumbling. I'm sure you'll agree with that. You have roads, rail, and various hubs that are underfunded. How can the U.S. come up with the money to build this up? I mean, some estimates have, for example, stated that billions of dollars are needed and years of work to restore the U.S. water supply, which got a D, by the way, to acceptable standards. That's just one example.
Right, there are huge numbers of productive investments that the United States could make. It's not that everything is crumbling, but certainly we're a major contributor to global climate disruption, and certainly there are many productive things we could do to improve things like the safety of dams and bridges. Indeed, about 6 miles from where I'm giving this interview, a major bridge across the Mississippi River famously fell into the river and killed several people. And so this is a win-win, and the answer to your question directly on funding is the United States, of course, is a nation with a sovereign currency that can borrow or simply issue money in its own currency, even without directly borrowing. So this is modern monetary theory. The problem is not cash. The problem is political willingness. Indeed, it's an inside joke in the United States whenever you say infrastructure week is coming, because President Trump has been, promising for 4 years now that next week he's going to do infrastructure, which would have great bipartisan support, and of course he's never actually done it.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to get back to you. I mean, talk about what he has said, political willingness. I mean, he just mentioned that there was a dam that was that fell apart and killed several people. You have drinking water, again, that had the D range, and people are getting sick off of that. Different states have actually cited that. So we'll see how this is going to pan out. As we already discussed, there seems to be a general consensus on the need for more resources for rebuilding the U.S. infrastructure. What is exactly standing in the way then?
I'm Lembit Opik, and in this edition of Cats and Dogs, we take a look at the fortunes of sleepy Joe Biden, the president-in-waiting, and a man who's forgotten the colour of his running mate, the name of his opponent, and he thinks Winston Churchill was an American president. Join me, Lembit Opik, for some howling good fun on Cats and Dogs here on Press TV.
Experts say the U.S. infrastructure faces a funding gap of more than $2 trillion needed by 2025. The intimidating specter raises the question of resource for financing the U.S. infrastructure needs. Many call for increased federal spending and a federal infrastructure bank to generate revenue and offer institutional investment to development projects. However, unlike the European countries that receive the major part of their infrastructure development funding from the national level, the U.S. federal government only provides 25% of the country's needed funding for development. Consequently, many argue that the presence of the private sector is essential. Those who are skeptical of federal government spending say the existence of a public-private partnership would be more efficient and cost-effective. Infrastructure is also critical to the employment rates in the U.S. These show that there is a need for a data-driven approach towards infrastructure funding rather than a politically driven one.
Well, people have even taken to social media to express their dissatisfaction with the ongoing political inaction on the problem of infrastructure in the U.S. Social media posts, best place to go for it, one of them anyways. Despite its importance, this particular tweet saying the two principal organizations that evaluate U.S. infrastructure have given it consistently poor grades. We saw that already. The World Economic Forum ranks U.S. infrastructure 13th in the world. How could that be if you have such low grades on that? Anyways, the next tweet here, the government put 21.2% of its funding that year to the war on terror. We have always had one of the highest military budgets of any country while allowing for poor infrastructure to kill off our own people, with approximately 14,000 highway deaths. Wow. You can see how what our guest William Black said there in terms of the bridge falling apart, and then for that to lead to deaths in the U.S. Again, another sign of the poor infrastructure. And then there's the COVID-19, of course, outbreak. When we take a look at that, it's something that we need to break it down with our guest, William Black. Okay, William, when we look at the impact of the COVID-19 virus hitting certain infrastructures more than others, maybe not directly, where should each candidate then be focusing his or her attention, in this case, his attention, when it comes to truly rebuilding America and making it great again?
COVID hasn't directly attacked infrastructure in the sense of destroying infrastructure, but it certainly has made it more difficult to do things like improve infrastructure by having construction projects that would be inside. and there hasn't been any political will on the part of the Republican majority leader in the Senate to do big infrastructure programs. And so we're in an unusual circumstance politically in which President Trump wants a large bill, including some infrastructure, and where the Democrats want it, but Mitch McConnell controls the Senate as majority leader and is, at least at this juncture, saying that he wants no legislation before the U.S. election, which is, in under 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you very much. William K. Black, professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, talking to us there. He did fail to mention about the fact that you still have this almost $3 trillion stimulus package for COVID-19, people who are suffering from it. Add to that the large infrastructure bill that Trump has proposed. How are they going to get to that? They can't even agree on it, so it's a bipartisan issue. It's time now to take a look at some of the news that is not being reported. With all the focus on the mainstream news surrounding the elections, this piece of news is actually being overlooked, mainly since it was dismissed as a conspiracy theory. The claim, Nancy Pelosi's bill regarding the 25th Amendment, is so that she can replace Joe Biden with Kamala Harris if the two take office following the next presidential election. Well, Donald Trump then tweeted this on October the 9th, soon after the news came out, that Crazy Nancy is looking at the 25th Amendment in order to replace Joe Biden with Kamala Harris, since Sleepy Joe is out of it. And then, in his rally in Michigan, this is what he said.
Kamala, do you like Kamala? Do you like her to be your first president? If he gets elected 3 weeks into his presidency, they'll say, Kamala, you ready? Let's go. That's why they're talking about the 25th Amendment.
Next, we go to a town in the U.S. called Elkhorn in the state of Wisconsin. The farmers who feed the United States and Americans are now having to make a hard choice at their own homes. Do they feed their cattle over the winter or feed their own families?
More sausages and eggs. So you have families who are deciding, do we lay off on feed? Do we cull our herd and take the loss? Do we, cut back on our own food bill? Families also are deciding, do we cut back on diapers and utilize the food pantry? So we've had a lot of emergency orders for diapers, personal care products, because families have had to make some really hard choices.
Here's where we ask, what happened to President Trump in terms of all the promises that he made on the economy, especially to the farmers? All right, on to the next one. This occurred at a rally. Former Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage, well, yes, that is the case. But why was he there? Perhaps it's a sign of what UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson wants to do with the UK. Come out of the EU and the trade deal that it has there and do what has been suspected for a long time and what Trump wants, make a trade deal with the US.
They were up there and they were very nervous in front of the Senate. They were very nervous. A friend of mine, a lot of people say one of the most powerful men in Europe, Nigel Farage.
Oh, I'm non-controversial and shy compared to you. I got to say, 4 years ago, I was honoured to come to America to bring the Brexit message, the message that you can beat the establishment. And that is what Donald Trump did. He beat the pollsters, he beat the media, he beat all the predictions. And here's the worst bit, they've never forgiven him for it.
Our final stop is a look at the electoral breakdown of the states. Now, this map has broken it down to solid and leaning Democratic and Republican states. Biden right now is above the 270 electoral vote based on this particular breakdown. And that's the threshold that's needed to win a majority of the 538 electorals available, leaving Trump with an uphill climb to win the re-election. Now, the ones in the yellowish-orange color are undecided or toss-up, with Florida, as of today, leaning towards Trump, which shows how close a race that this may be and how Trump is actually closing in on the gap. Now, this is the national poll. Biden coming in at 51.4%, versus Trump's 42.8%. But with the margin of error being at least 5%, this just shows how close elections are, which is why Trump has said votes should not be counted after the initial results come in. And that does it for this edition of the program. Thanks for tuning in. The next time we meet will be next Friday, after the elections. Well, it's quite ironic, actually, that the U.S. presidential election falls on November 3. In case you don't know, November 3 corresponds with the 13th of Aban in the Iranian calendar, which is known as Student Day. It's a day to honor those who stormed the U.S. Embassy called the Den of Spies, coming less than 9 months after the toppling of Iran's American-backed Shah. What do you think about that? I'm Kavit Taghli. See you next Friday after the U.S. elections. It's goodbye for now.